about, flying starfish. We all know the story. It's a teaching story from Western culture about this little kid who's walking on the beach and he finds hundreds and hundreds of starfish that have been washed up on the beach after a storm. So he reaches down and he tosses one back into the ocean, and then he grabs another one and then another one. And there's an older gentleman who's walking by and he says, "Hey, kid, what are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm saving the starfish." And the guy says, "Look, there's hundreds of them on the beach. You'll never save them all." And the kid picks up another one and says, "Well, I saved that one." And I think for behavioral health, I think that's a pretty apt metaphor for the work that we do. But as we all know, the storms of life keep washing starfish up onto the beach, sometimes ones that we recognize and remember, and that's discouraging for us and sometimes leads to burnout. Also not much fun for the starfish. But I'd like to call your attention to another story. And that's the story of a young girl who's relaxing on the bank of a swiftly flowing stream, just basking in the sunlight. And suddenly she hears this panicked barking sound. And she looks out, and there in the middle of the stream, floating by, is this puppy who's thrashing around in the river. And so she's, "Oh my gosh." And so she jumps in, fully clothed. She jumps in and manages to bring the puppy back to shore. And so she gets a few thank you licks, and the puppy runs away. And so she stretches out in the sun to dry, only to hear another puppy. So still wet, back into the water she goes, and another, and she brings in another one, and finally, just exhausted, realizes that she can't save them all. And then when she looks up the riverbank, there's a guy throwing puppies in the river. So up the stream our hero goes, and after some energetic discussions, convinces the guy to stop throwing puppies in the river. So the parallels that we do in this work is pretty obvious, or maybe not. I mean, metaphorically, who's the guy who hates puppies? I mean, is it the drug dealer on the corner, the bootlegger who brings stuff onto the res? Is it the bartender who will let you drink all night in exchange for your sobriety coin, or big pharma that floods the river with pills? And, as terrible as those things are, I think that they kind of miss the point. Because for most of our peeps, especially the frequent flyers, the upstream villain is really drama, is really trauma. And we get puzzled why, after we rescue them and dry them off and surround them with love and coping skills, so many of our puppies run back upstream only to get thrown into the river again. Well, the common denominator may well be coming from the experience of trauma. Now, it doesn't matter much if it's big T trauma like rape or war, or childhood full of little t trauma like domestic violence or neglect. The cumulative effect on the nervous system is only a difference of degree. So here is, the adverse childhood experiences. These have been around for almost 25 years now. Most of you have had some experience with them. And they look at some of the things that happen to children between birth and age 18 that result later on in not just behavioral health issues and depression and substance use, but also a lot of chronic medical conditions that can lead to early death. But for the folks that we work with, there's a deeper layer of this. There's the prenatal, historical, and cultural, and particularly the epigenetic loading. That this underground, this subtext of generational embodiment. I mean, trauma actually changes the DNA and makes subsequent generations more exquisitely sensitive and vulnerable to stressors. And then we have, partially as a result of that, we have a lot of social conditions and local context that actually accelerates this trend. Then also looking at this, and again, I apologize for reminding people of their history, but looking at there was once a really vibrant culture on this planet pre-contact, before colonial contact, and I'm just beginning to understand from some of my reading how how rich and how varied this was. I mean, there were things here that rivaled anything that was available in Europe at the time, and probably in many ways a lot better. But then we have the cultural clash, we have the clash of contact. And not only do we have the terrible diseases and the epidemics for people who had no immunity to these new diseases like smallpox, which, as we know, were sometimes weaponized and deliberately used to cull the population. And then we have the eras of cultural loss, and this is where we suffer the loss of language, the loss of culture, the loss of the songs and the stories, and all of those things, largely as a result of the boarding school experience and all of the removals. But now there is this revitalization of the culture that's been going on since Restoration days began. It actually a long time before that, but going on more formally since Restoration activities in the 1970s. So this is where we are now. So again, something that you all know, the so-called despair deaths. We all know that the highest rates of alcohol-related deaths and suicides are in areas with high Native American and Alaska Native peoples. So these are some of the things that bring people to our door. But why is it that some of our best efforts as clinicians sometimes only seem to have a temporary benefit? And I think that when it comes to treating people who come from the experience of trauma, we may not be using the right tool for the job. We all know on some level that the impact of trauma gets stored in the body-mind in different ways. Sometimes as a body memory, sometimes as an unconscious or implicit memory that's stored in the fight, flight, or freeze limbic system of the brain. But what do these two trauma repositories have in common? Unfortunately, they're inaccessible to most of our treatment interventions. So many of the treatment interventions that come out of Western research are really targeted at the prefrontal cortex and the parts of the brain that are most involved with logic and figuring things out. The problem is that the limbic system doesn't understand language. The limbic system does not understand language. It only thinks in images. And so it's impossible to logic people out of being trapped in their stories. We have to find another way. And of course, Native culture and other cultural wisdom traditions have been finding these wonderful interventions for centuries. So traditionally, most of our treatment modalities, with the possible exception of EMDR and yoga and somatic experiencing and stuff like that, they rely on psychoeducation. There's cognitive restructuring and skills acquisition. So the evidence-based manuals that come out of Western research are used to kind of hammer home the benefits and the pathways to recovery from these mental health and substance use disorders. The problem is, when it comes to treating trauma that keeps tossing our patients back in the river, it's like trying to drive a screw with a hammer. Okay, if you're really patient and you're really good, you can do it, but it simply isn't the right tool for the job. So these Western evidence-based practices in our toolbox, they're wonderful for pruning and weeding and watering the garden of woes that bring people to our door. But why is it that some of them stop growing and just kind of go to seed, and others seem to just bloom so brightly for a while, only to wither and die? It's because our patients can't grow healthy plants in poisoned soil. Their roots are sunk so deep into the pain of the past that it unconsciously contaminates and sabotages our best efforts to help them get well. Now, you all know about Don Coyhis and the Wellbriety movement. That's been a vital part of recovery in Indian country for 30 years. So he has the concept of a healing forest of healthy trees that grow in healthy soil. Now, what we do often in treatment is we kind of repot our folks. You know, we get them in and we get them into a new thing, but then we send them back home. We send them back into that toxic, traumatic underground where these trauma triggers keep activating these preconscious and unconscious trauma responses. So speaking of repotting, that brings to mind another metaphor, and I have to admit I never metaphor I didn't like. One of the reasons, by the way, that metaphors are so useful in treatment is because of the limbic system. It offers an image. It's not a thought out thing. It's something that kind of sneaks in under the radar. So the lives of our patients have been broken and fragmented by this trauma, often from a very early age. Their souls have been shattered like a piece of pottery. So that brings us to the second problem with many of our treatment efforts. We tend to focus on the fragments of the jar, at least in Western treatment we do, because it's all symptom driven, right? We focus on the fragments of the jar, the removals, the boarding schools, the theft of land and resources, the missing murdered Indigenous women and two spirits, all of that stuff, the destruction of the family. The list is just long and painful. But those fragments are pieces of a person who once was whole, and they can be again, and that's our work. There's an ancient Japanese art that's called kintsugi, which translates into golden seams. It's joining broken shards of pottery with gold. The beauty is in, and the strength is in the broken places. And so there are ways that we can use the richness of Native culture to bring a rebirth of healing and wholeness, which binds the brokenness of trauma together. Now, this is the real essence of trauma responsive care. Evidence-based practices are great, but in and of themselves, by themselves, they are insufficient. They are necessary, but insufficient. So this gives depth and meaning to the context of the evidence-based practices that we're asked to use in treatment. So we can help our patients to find the strength of spirit to mend their broken lives. Okay, so what's the antidote to this poisoned soil? The answer, I believe, is hope. Our main job as clinicians is to help our patients borrow some hope from us. Not some bullshit platitude, just make lemonade hope, but vibrant, capital H hope that they no longer have to be prisoners of their history. And there are some slogans from AA that kind of speak to this. But so how can we honor this opportunity with our patients? Well, one way is to begin with the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, or some kind of trauma-informed psychosocial interview to see how deep the soil of trauma is. Then we begin to honor and build on the resilience that helped them find their way to our door. So often the temptation is, if you're working with a symptom-driven model, we ignore the strengths, we ignore the resilience. One of the things I tell every patient is, if surviving this didn't kill you, getting over it isn't going to. But this is one of the things to understand about this. Again, metaphorically speaking, many of you have children, and toddlers they're interested in what's going on, and you're in the kitchen working something on the stove, maybe making some fry bread or working up some stew or something. And of course, out of curiosity, your little toddler reaches up and tries to grab something on the stove, and you say, "No, don't do that. Don't do that. It's hot. You'll burn yourself." Well, of course, kids listen so well. Okay, so they reach up and they burn themselves, and they, and we nurture them, and all of that stuff. And so the kid has learned, don't touch hot stuff on the stove. Okay. People who come from the experience of trauma have been burned by the stove so often. Not only do they not reach up on the stove, they've spent most of their lives not even going into the kitchen. What happened in there is so frightening and so formative. They don't think about it necessarily, because remember, this is all subliminal. This is all preconscious. There's so much of it is preconscious. They just wonder why Why does this keep happening to me? Why do I keep marrying my parents? Why do I keep, all of those kinds of things that we see all the time as clinicians and as elders? Okay, so that's nice, Mike. How do we go about doing this? Well, first of all, we have to assess our programs. We have to assess the approaches that we take. And here are some evidence-based things that are pretty common sense. We have to create a context of safety with physical safety and clear boundaries and transparency and particularly predictability. We have to help people to reclaim their power. We can't restore it. I don't like that, but that's their wording, not mine. We have to help them to reclaim their personal power and celebrate their strengths and their resilience and give them that broader perspective to recognize that, the kitchen is really only one room in the house. And then really supporting their self-worth and valuing them. But then that's only part of the thing. Now we have to assess our clients. So how do we do that? This is a version of the Adverse Childhood Experiences survey. And I've made two fairly significant modifications to it. And I do it from a clinical basis. I mean, I don't do research, so I'm not trying to replicate studies here. One of the problems with the Adverse Childhood Experiences survey as it existed was back when Anders and Felitti did this, published it back in the late 1990s. They looked at people who were from birth to age 18. It was an almost exclusively white, middle-class population sample. These were people who were coming into a regular, everyday medical clinic for diabetes, for high blood pressure, for, arthritis and rheumatism and all kinds of things. So they gathered a lot of really, really good data from this. But I think they missed the boat I think there was a need for some further development. Far be it from me to criticize folks I've never met who make a lot more money than I do. Two things I think that became evident as I began to work with this, and I've been working with the ACEs since 2000, 2001, something like that. Two things. Number one, I limited it from birth to age 12. My reasoning for doing that is that at about age 12 is when kids are beginning to move out of the concrete operational stage of psychosocial development. Their brains are now beginning to develop the ability to abstract, but they're not really good at it yet. The other thing is, if you think about it, sexual abuse or rape at any age is a terrible, terrible thing. But the impact that it makes at age 7 is hugely different from the impact at age 17. At least by age 17, we have some life experience, maybe some coping skills, maybe some support and some friendships that 7-year-olds simply don't have. So I think it's important to look at the age. The other thing is it ignores resilience. So this is a copy of this revised ACEs. It's in your handouts. You're free to take it and use it or not as you see fit. These things here are the original 10 trauma categories: emotional, physical, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, seeing domestic violence, seeing mother treated violently in the home, living in a home where there was substance abuse or mental illness, broken homes where family members were getting divorced or leaving all the time, a succession of parental figures moving through the home, and finally incarceration. But I think it's important to look at where along this continuum is my experience. And that it gets us away from that all or nothing black and white thinking. This is terrible. This happened to me. It must, well, what kind of an impact did it have? How old were you when it happened? And really beginning to recognize that this experience exists on a continuum. It's on a volume knob, not a light switch. So looking at, and these are just pretty arbitrary. They were just kind of words that, that I tried to kind of find the polar opposite of whatever the trauma was. And looking at, okay, as a result of this experience, whatever it was, maybe I didn't have any emotional abuse when I was growing up. So as a result of that, how did that strengthen my sense of self? The fact that I never had to deal with this particular type of trauma. And what it does, it begins to focus them again on the resilience, helping them focus on the solution rather than the problem. I mean, aren't we supposed to be doing solution-focused therapy? Now, the next part. This was the part that I was really I was a little worried about presenting this, but I present it to you in a good way. And I asked several Native colleagues that I work with to take a look at this and offer me some thoughts and some feedback on it. I'm also welcome to your feedback, and my contact information is available at the end. This is a very complex and sensitive topic, but looking at forms of trauma that are perhaps more unique to the Alaska Native American experience, or indigenous peoples anywhere. This is my attempt to respectfully look at that. Looking at, did some of my relatives, did some of my family members come from the boarding school experience? And as you all know, even if they didn't have some of the terrible abusive experiences that we're just now finding out about. We all know about, not being able to speak your language, having to kneel on rice, if you spoke your native language, all of those things. Even if they didn't have those terrible experiences, and I've worked with folks in Alaska who went to boarding schools there who had a wonderful experience, and it really seemed to open up the world to them. But still, they never learned how to parent in a traditional way. And so when they had kids, and you all know this, I know that I'm preaching to the choir. So looking at the boarding school experience and the extinguishment, the deliberate extinguishing of culture, what is the opposite of that? And where along this continuum do we, as providers, because we all came from some form of trauma ourselves, or we wouldn't be doing this, we'd be doing something that's a lot more fun. The loss of language, not being familiar with the songs and the stories, the disruption of passing along native wisdom that came from this experience. Not being familiar with ceremonies and traditions. They weren't part of our growing up, perhaps. Looking at the removals, growing up around a lot of, a lot of anger and resentment about, stolen land and resources. I had a particularly moving experience with this one in particular. When I was back in Wisconsin, fairly early in my career as a substance abuse clinician, I was working with somebody. It happened to be a DUI group, driving under the intoxication. So it's basically a psychoeducational group. And I had a Native gentleman in that group who was in his early 30s, middle 30s maybe. And he had held top management positions in 2 Native tribes and one of the largest casinos in Wisconsin. Had a master's degree from, I forget from where, but basically in administration. So he'd been a tribal administrator, very, very smart guy. And he'd been to treatment, I forget, 3 or 4 times. And I asked him one day, I said, hey, you can do group as well as I can. I mean, geez, you've done this before. What's it going to take for you to change? And he looked me in the eye and he said, 500 years back rent. And I thought, whoa. Now, this was before I was very deeply involved with, working with Native folks. He's now dead. About 10 years after that, he drank himself to death. That's some of the ways in which that impotent rage can kind of seal a person and encapsulate them and keep them from being able to get well. So looking at the restorations, bullying and microaggressions and sometimes macroaggressions. I have a patient of mine right now who got it from both ends because he is a blonde, blue-eyed native guy. So in school, he got it from both ends because, you know, the white kids knew he was native and the native kids thought he looked too white. And so he really, you know, and he developed a lot of strengths coming out of that. Looking at violence and suicide and some of these things. And again, the idea here is not to celebrate the trauma, but to look at what are the, and even if they haven't had this experience, even if my patient has not had this experience, this brings to their consciousness or to their awareness that it's possible. It's possible to treat people with kindness. It's possible to regain my knowledge of culture and wisdom and all that kind of stuff. It admits of the possibility of change. Okay. So I offer this in a good way. I hope that it doesn't seem presumptuous on my part. I mean, the last thing I told Megan when I sent this to her, the last thing I want to do is come across as a pretendian. But I do think that there's some benefit to looking at this. So I offer it in a good way. So, okay, trauma responsive and trauma informed care. What's the difference? We use those terms almost interchangeably, but I submit to you respectfully that they're not. What are some of the characteristics of trauma-informed treatment? Well, okay, we acknowledge that trauma exists. We look at things through the lens of diagnosis. You know, we all have a whole section of the DSM-5, you know, that now looks at PTSD and acute trauma and complicated bereavement and adjustment disorders, which actually should have been there in the first place. We look at things through the lens of diagnosis. We treat our clients as survivors. And we look for ways to identify and treat, and the staff are the experts. The program has the power, okay? Trauma responsive care is different. It's looking through the other end of the binoculars. We recognize that trauma is a universal human experience. It's not unique to you or to the culture that you come from. But we look at it through the lens of resiliency and competence rather than symptom-driven. We help patients to see that this is what happened to them, not who they are. We help the patient to rewrite their story in the present tense in order to heal. No matter how long you live in the past, it never gets any better, right? And then my patient is the expert. My patient figured out how to live long enough to get to me. And I really need to honor and celebrate that. Okay, so who needs it? Well, every person who walks in our door is potentially someone who comes from the experience of trauma of one form or another. So everyone should be offered the opportunity to be screened, starting with your staff. We can use the ACEs survey, either the traditional, either the research one or the one that I've offered here. The SSRS, the social readjustment rating scale, there are stress inventories, there are all kinds of things that help bring some focus to it. But who should be doing it? Everyone in the facility, not just the counselors. Every single receptionist, office staff, custodian, everybody has a chance to change a life. Your clients are sizing you up even before you realize it. They come often with some preconceived notions of what treatment is going to be like, and some of it's not really very favorable. So recognizing that as they sit in your waiting room, healing has already begun or not. Who are they? They're not victims. They're not survivors. Both of those things, both of those labels keep them trapped in their story. These are people who have had a unique opportunity to develop a set of strengths and resiliency that we need to understand and that they need to feel safe enough to share with us. So working with people who come from the experience of trauma starts before they walk in the door. You don't always think about that. What is your agency's reputation in the consumer community? Do you know? It requires us to become aware of their awareness. Okay, is the waiting room calm and welcoming? Are the support staff friendly and helpful? Are there some perceptual barriers that we may not have thought about? There was an agency that I worked for a period of time, which shall remain nameless. And I had some real energetic discussions with the management of that particular outpatient clinic. There was a locked door between the waiting room and the counseling offices. And I went to them and I said, look, that locked door sends an unmistakable message to every person in that waiting room. And they said, well, yeah. Why do you do that? Well, I mean, mental health people can be dangerous. What would happen if somebody came in and tried to be violent with one of our counselors? And I said, has it ever happened? They said, well, no. I'm sorry to say that I lost that battle, but it's that kind of awareness that we don't always bring to the work that we do, but our patients sure do. So how are potential clients greeted? Just because they're engaged, they're here, doesn't mean that they're engaged. They're sizing you up before you're even aware of it. For instance, how did you dismiss the client before them? They saw that. A welcoming smile can turn a handshake into a heart shake. I sanitize my hands obviously and visibly before every client that I greet, and I ask them if they're okay with a freshly sanitized handshake. Because it's the contact, it is the skin-to-skin contact that starts the healing process. We're always asking them to, examine their values and their assumptions. How about us? What is our idea of what they are like? Okay, why do you think they're here? If you come into it, I've done a lot of work with drug court programs in a couple of different states, and the idea that they're only here to get their driver's license back. Oh, cool. Okay. Looking at transference and countertransference and knowing yourself well enough to know when you're stressed, and you will be, where do you fall on the Karpman triangle? That's the victim, persecutor, rescuer triangle. Where do you find yourself on that? And that's just an important piece of self-awareness. It's not a judgment, but it's good to know kind of where you fall with that. So working with people who come from the experience of trauma really requires a different heart set as well as a mindset. You never get a second chance to make a first impression. They may forget this. I got this from a clinical supervisor that I worked with 10 years or so ago. They may forget what you said or did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. That's what's going to stick with them. And it requires a level of openness to their experience that sometimes challenges our traditional boundaries. We were taught in graduate school, always keep an arm's length from your patients. You have to have this professional boundary, this wall between me and my patient. Respectfully, that's bullshit. So, we all know counseling 101, they don't care what you know till they know that you care. The famous quote from Carl Rogers, if your only tool is a hammer, you'll treat every person like they're a nail. Whose needs are getting met here? And why did they come here? This is one of the problems that I have with our intake process in Western ways of doing things, because it's so symptom driven. People come to see me for one of two reasons, okay? Either they're hurting and they want some help, or they really don't want to be here and somebody's making them come. If we spend the first 90 minutes of our lives together meeting my needs instead of their needs, in other words, filling out reams and reams of paperwork and all that kind of stuff, which maybe brings up some of the educational things that they're not very proud of. In what parallel universe is that welcoming? So and I also explained to them, I said, we have to arrive at a diagnosis here, okay? But diagnosis is only important for two things: billing and prescribing medication, and I don't do either one. Okay? But we got to have a hook to hang this on so that your insurance will pay for it. And it kind of just, kind of takes some of the emotional sting out of the diagnosis process. Truly, I don't care why they come. I only care why they stay. So one thing to bear in mind is that rules are not safe. Rules are what other people in power use to hurt me, and they only seem to work for the other guy, right? Developmentally, many of the people who come to see us are at a maturity level where rules are only meant to be challenged or evaded or manipulated, right? So trust and transparency rely on reasons, not just rules. Okay, so what's the why? Why is this in place? Why is there a locked door between the waiting room and the counseling offices? Group rules, usually a waste of time. They're based on the establishment expectations for minimally acceptable behavior. They're the lowest common denominator of compliance. And they're based on a power differential between the counselor or the program and the client. They often lead to a power struggle. And by the way, if I get into a power struggle with my client, I've already lost. I just don't know it yet. So they tell the group exactly how to challenge your control, and they will not disappoint you. But we got to have some form, something that's going to hold the experience, the value of the experience together. Well, keeping it simple, just for today, I commit to honesty with myself and everybody else. I pledge openness to other people's beliefs and opinions, and I agree not to preach or attack anybody, to offer my truth quietly and respectfully, and to respect the privacy of the circle. What more do you need in terms of group rules? So looking at native modalities and things that are presented by elders. And these are things that I did not grow up with, but I've been privileged to work with a number of native communities over the last 30 years or so. And so I offer these as things that have been passed along to me, or an awareness anyway, that's been passed along to me. Ceremony, native ceremony restores balance. It restores the parts of the medicine wheel. It restores the cognitive, the mental, the physical, the emotional, and most particularly the spiritual. And actually, it starts with the spiritual and spreads out from there. We all know that. So in many ways, culture is the cure. So these are some principles that come from the American Indian and Alaska Native communities. Recognizing, again, trauma is universal. Everybody has been impacted by trauma in their lives. Native American, Alaska Native communities have systems of providers who recognize that most of the people that they know have suffered the negative consequences and may have developed some symptoms that are not in and of themselves pathology. They're coping, maybe ineffective, but they are attempts to survive. So because trauma is so common, we need to look at it as from a non-diagnostic approach. And working with people who've been harmed and those who have caused them harm is not only compassionate, but it's really necessary. Honoring the resilience that has allowed Native culture to thrive in the face of colonial aggression for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. The personal strengths, the personal resilience that has grown out of that is the soil in which we want to plant those seeds of recovery. Looking at how trust and safety and confidential support, effective healing relationships are built on trust, and they build the ability for empowerment. We can't empower anybody, but we can allow them the safety to begin to take back their power. Safe, sacred, and nurturing environments are necessary for healing. And I say sacred in the largest word, sense of that word. So using an integrated mind, body, spirit approach, that's I added spirit. This is a direct quote from there, but I'm adding spirit in there. It's a primary goal in creating an effective healing environment. Healing models and native ceremony, not just being able to use ceremony by itself, perfectly valid, perfectly wonderful thing to do, but how do you, for those of us who are clinicians, how do you document a sweat lodge in such a way that insurance will pay for it, right? So looking at the models that have attempted to blend these two wisdom traditions, taking the Etwaftmok is the two-eyed seeing that comes from the Edward Marshall and the Micmac folks up in Canada, looking at how both native wisdom traditions and Western research base are not mutually exclusive. We can find ways that they can bind together that strengthens each of them. We have to give people options. We have to give people options. And the diversity of points of view that people bring to us have to be celebrated. Knowing that the roots of trauma, the taproot of trauma goes very, very deep. It penetrates the individual, the family, and the community. So the whole community has to be a part of the healing process. This is the Dankoi's healing forest idea. Addressing the traumatic events in an individual can uncover systemic cycles of trauma, but we have to address the whole issue. Community provider and justice systems, often have to be engaged. That's one of the things that I just loved about doing drug court programs. Looking at non-diagnostic, non-judgmental care. Okay. Judgment is a wonderful barrier to any kind of healing. And often people from any marginalized community, whether it's indigenous or Black or any other, are pretty exquisitely sensitive to slights, whether they're intended or not. So we have to be really, really careful about that. So these are from a report in 2009, American Indian Alaska Native Communities Trauma-Informed Care Network. Some really good stuff. So what are some of the ways that we can, some ways for those of us who did not grow up in the culture, and I happen to be one of those, how can we find effective ways to bring some of these things to the people that we work with? This is a wonderful one, the Konkasavik. The Konkasavik is it's the Yupik word for a toolbox. And it has I think like 68 or more pages of cultural and subsistence activities, including dances, including songs, including subsistence activities, including storytelling and all kinds of things that really bring the healthiest and most vibrant parts of Yupik and Chupik culture together to help our young people. The People Awakening Project in Alaska is wonderful. The teachings of the Konkasavik, and that's kind of where this came from. These are some of the things that are involved in that. Creating your own teachings. One of the things that they do is they invite young people to kind of re-experience their own culture and their own spiritual tradition. For those of you who are in the Washington state area, the canoe journey is one of the things that came out of that experience, and looking at how Native wisdom and the stories that go along with the canoe journey are things that can really help. The Yugyarak, the right way to be a human being, is a very strong thing in Yupik culture. Celebrating sobriety, celebrating dance and traditional garb and traditional dances. Looking at subsistence, and the fact that, the land provides for us. And really looking at that, subsistence is not just about calories. It's not just about we have to cut up, a few 100 pounds of salmon in the summer so that we can make it through the winter. That's a big part of it, but also the experience and the reverence with which that's done, and the honoring of that as being a tradition that's centuries old. The stories of strength, every culture has their stories of strength. One in the native, the Diné, the Navajo is the, and I'm going to mispronounce it, and I apologize in advance. The Hojonja, the Hojo, the corn pollen path, and knowing what yours are. The Wellbriety movement is one that we all know. This is interesting. This Rod Vickers, it takes the Seeking Safety, the Lisa Nayavitz trauma-informed workbook, and puts it on the medicine wheel. And looks at, again, Atwapmuk, two-eyed seeing, looking at our patients as existing along this continuum around the cycle of the seasons and the seasons of life, and what are the necessary tasks for them to be able to acquire so that they could be successful. Ceremony restores balance. The sweat lodge, the Sundance ceremony, smudging, and all of those things really cement the process of trauma responsive care, trauma responsive healing. So this is where that ancient art meets ancient wisdom. Kintsugi, the golden seams, joining these broken pieces of the jar of spirit together. The beauty is in the broken places, and the rebirth of healing and wholeness, which holds the brokenness of trauma together stronger than it ever was to begin with. This is the true essence of trauma responsive care, helping our patients use their culture and resilience and the strength of spirit to mend their broken lives and the lives of their family. So our main job as clinicians is to hold open the door of possibility and guide our patients through to a life that's worth living. And so as we start to kind of bring this to a close, I'd invite you to just take a moment and jot down for yourself one or two ways that you might begin to adapt some of these concepts in the work that you do. Perhaps you are familiar with all or most of them. So how then can you pass some of that knowledge and awareness along to other people that you work with? So just take a moment as we begin to kind of wind this down for the last few minutes. Just jot down a couple of things, and even, I suppose, put them in the chat if you want to do that. Because the whole idea of this is not to go through, an interesting and hopefully humorous hour of training and then forget it all on the way home. The whole idea is to bring this to life in the work that you do. So in closing, I want to celebrate together the inspiration and dedication that each of you brings to your work. You work to be the difference that makes a difference in the lives of the people you serve. And that, my friends, is work worth doing. We help people to mend their broken hearts. It's good stuff. And the reward for all the work we do, well, someday maybe the last starfish and happy puppies. So I want to thank you again for bringing hope, help, and healing to the people that you serve. If you would like, this is an opportunity for you, if you scan this QR code on your monitor, or even, I don't know if you can do it on your phone. But anyway, or if you go to the Talk AC / Mike Bricker, and by the way, these slides are all coming to you. They're all coming to you in a PDF format. If you scan that, it will take you to a website where you can rate three things about this webinar. And if you type in the word relax, it says there's a code. If you type that in, what happens is that takes you to a website where you can get a free YouTube video of a relaxation and anchoring exercise that I've used for many years with patients. Very different from the clench and release, the kind of standard progressive relaxation. But there's a YouTube video and a script for the anchoring that's available to you. Feel free to use it, distribute as you wish, give it to your clients, pass it along to your colleagues. This is how you can get a hold of me if you have any interest or want to discuss anything, or if you would like to have some training brought to the folks that you work with. I'd be happy to do that. So with that said, I guess I'm going to leave this up, Megan, and ask you to kind of take back the steering wheel. If there are any comments, any questions that I can answer, we've got a couple of minutes left, and I have no place to be, so we can go for as long as folks are curious.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask Mike directly. But thank you, first of all, Mike, for doing this.
Oh, sure, you're very welcome.
Very uplifting, strengths-based approach, I think, that you provide to many of us. So thank you.
Oh, thanks. And by the way, feel free to challenge me. I mean, things aren't true just because I say they are.
I'm not seeing too many questions in the chat, just a lot of thank yous, some agreements. So we'll give it a minute or so and see. But if no one has any questions for Mike, we'll close out.
I do.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Mike. Yeah, I came in a bit late after an appointment canceled this morning. So I was really looking forward to seeing this. So as I came in, you were describing HONOR. It was an acronym. Can you tell me what that acronym means again?
Let's see if I can remember. It'll be on, honoring the sacred, and it's something that I developed when I was doing talking circles. To be honest with myself, to be open to other people's opinions, not to preach or to belittle other people, to have openness to other people's opinions, and to respect the privacy of the circle or something like that. I have that as a handout someplace, Michael. If you'll email me, I'll be happy to hand it to you. I'll send it to you.
You're pretty close, Mike. Honesty with yourself and others, openness to other beliefs and opinions, not preach or attack my peers, offer my truth quietly and respectfully, and respect the privacy of the group.
Yeah.
And that is a handout.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah, and if I send you my email, you'll just send me the handouts for this.
You guys don't need to send your email. We already have it because you registered for the webinar.
Oh, okay.
And so it'll go to that email that
so all of that stuff, there's a PDF of the slides. There's a copy of that that revised ACEs handout. And I think there's a copy of the script for the relaxation and anchoring thing in there as well.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mike.
Sure, you're very welcome.
Yep. So that'll come in the next few days. So be on the lookout for that from the native
and a copy and a recording, I believe. Yes.
Yep. And then that'll be on our YouTube page. So this email that you get for follow-up will have a bunch of different links that you can access all this information. So
okay, well then I guess in closing, I want to thank everybody for your time and attention. And hopefully you'll find some ways to use some of this stuff in the work that you do, or find new and interesting ways for yourself of doing it. And if you find any of those, please feel free to share them with me.
Well, thanks again, Mike, for
you're very welcome.
And we look forward to having you on again.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Take care.